Hi everyone, my name is Mary Shirley and I am delighted to have been invited to present a video series with Streamline Verify. We've carefully curated a series of topics that we think will be of the greatest interest to healthcare compliance practitioners operating in the current environment in 2023. So we kick off with successful relationships with vendors. Thank you for having me, Stephen.
Good morning, Mary. Hi, how are you? It's a pleasure to have you here.
Wonderful.
To get right into this, we've been in this space for over about a decade, and what I've noticed is from when we started till today, there are so many more vendors that are in this space. Um, we used to go to the conferences. There were a handful of vendors in the space. Today, there's a there's tons of vendors that are available to help compliance officers meet all their requirements and help them with their workflows. I remember back when we started, there was no gatekeepers. It was so much easier to get in touch with a compliance officer. Today, they definitely have someone protecting the gate to make sure that nobody can get in. So, as a compliance officer yourself, Mary, when it comes time to selecting a vendor, especially vendors that are important to make sure that there are no consequences if something gets missed. What are your key considerations? How do you prioritize and ensure that you have good, successful vendor relationships and that there's no regret?
Absolutely. That's a great question. And you know what? It's one that we don't talk about an awful lot publicly, but it's such a critical aspect of what makes for a holistic um, success point for a compliance officer. So you're absolutely right. I think there are many, many vendors these days. I've just attended a conference where there were so many new names in the exhibit booth of vendors that I was not already familiar with. So it's certainly a large space. And the way that I would think of it for any vendors feeling frustrated about the gatekeeping is that for every half hour a compliance officer spends doing a call with a vendor, if they're not a warm lead, if they're not currently looking for any services, that's 30 minutes of time they'll have to stay longer at the end of the day to complete their core work, away from their families, away from their hobbies, away from the TV, which can be a more relaxing experience than work. And so, in my opinion, the greatest thing that a vendor can do is build a genuine relationship and understand that the pipeline can be very long, especially if the compliance officer isn't immediately looking for something at the moment. But what about when we are? Last year, I invited the compliance community to chat with me about very successful vendor relationships and some of the frustrations and letdowns. And the conversations were very insightful. What I learned is that the relationship can really add a lot of stress or happiness to a compliance officer's life. And so it's important that we get it right from the outset. So, in terms of selecting a vendor, you absolutely want to have a list of items that you require that you want to get out of the solution, clearly explain what your goal is. But you can't stop there. And the analogy that I would use, that I think you would be very familiar with, when it comes to exclusion checks, for example, trust is not an internal control. We can't do exclusion checks just by listening out for a healthcare practitioner to tell us, oh, it's absolutely fine, don't worry, I'm not on any naughty lists. You can absolutely go ahead and onboard me. So, for us, we need to do our appropriate due diligence, in this case, exclusion, sanctions, watch list checks. When it comes to us as compliance officers choosing, we absolutely should be chatting with people like yourself, Stephen, to get information about your capabilities and responses to the questions that we have. But to do our full due diligence, we should also be speaking with our peers in our networks and asking them for their views, because it's a more unbiased view, but it's also coming from someone who's in the shoes of what we do as well. And it's not enough, in my opinion, to just ask friends, or who do you recommend or who do you use? make sure that you're asking them very specific questions that align with your priorities. Because if we only ask, who is it that you use, they'll tell us about all the things that they like that suit their company's needs, which may be different to yours. And I'll give a very simplistic example, but I think it's one that is easily relatable. If, for example, a US domestic healthcare system uses a certain provider for something and they don't need to have translations, perhaps they use English for everything, and maybe Spanish is added as well. But what about for the multinational compliance practitioner who's working in a very large organization with presence all over the world? They might need translations in 30 plus languages. And if they're upset with vendors who are providing poor quality translations, essentially Google Translate where it's not 100% perfect, what they're looking for is slightly different to the domestic healthcare system that is perhaps focused on other things, or certainly not focused on a multitude of high quality translations. So my best advice in this instance is to make sure that you're doing all of your due diligence, remembering that trust is not an internal control.
It, it's interesting because what I've noticed at some points is more in the past, not so frequently, is a lot of times the vendors don't know the questions to ask, even when they're calling for references with other, about us. They don't know the questions to ask. They don't know how to compare apples to apples.
Mm-hmm.
There are so many solutions that are available today in all areas of compliance, and everyone does things a little differently. Some are more similar with others, but everyone has their nuances that makes them better. But the compliance officer really doesn't know those questions to ask. So what we
Yes.
did is, when I compiled over the years, I'm fortunate that I get to hear a lot of the questions.
Mm-hmm.
I sit on the other side of the desk. So I get to hear some of those questions. And what we've done is we compiled a Rolodex of all these questions that we can send out to that compliance officer to make them smarter, to know what questions that they should be asking in the space.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, you always want to add and make those questions, more for your workflow than for what I think your workflow should be. But there are so many things that you have to make sure you're covering, particularly in our space and in general when you're looking for the right provider.
What a great resource. I love that idea.
Yes, thanks.
So, one of the things that I also wanted to mention that I noticed in my conversations with peers is that there have unfortunately been situations where individuals who are working with a provider find that if they're unhappy with the relationship with their contact at the vendor, sometimes they ask for a change in representative because they want to deal with someone else. And quite surprisingly, some of the vendors do not allow for that and say, no, you must continue working with this person, which really, the first time that happened to me, it boggled my mind. And the frustrating thing is that, you're already in a contract as a compliance officer. There is limited that you can do in that situation if you are frustrated because you're contractually bound to continue on. And I would say to any vendors who are utilizing this practice to consider the age old adage, just because you can doesn't mean you should. That's a real reputational risk hit. It's not the most ethical thing to do. But as compliance officers, how we can look out for this is to preempt this pitfall in the preliminary discussions process with vendors and specifically ask the question, what happens in the event that we're dissatisfied with the relationship with the business sponsor or representative at your organization? And then once you have an agreement as to how that will be addressed and it's satisfactory to you, you may wish to get that documented in your contract with the vendor as well.
Very smart. I can't imagine not listening to the customer. Like that story that you bring up is shocking. Like if
Yeah.
someone asks for switching an account rep, like how does the vendor not listen? Like, and that's to the first point you bring, but like the second thing you said with contracts, I remember one time I was in the airport and someone had this concern, like, let's say something doesn't go right. And my belief has always been is that the way you treat your customer when you're onboarding them it's the same way you should treat them when they're leaving, because you know why, Mary? You never know when they'll come back around. And if you're
Exactly.
a poor sport, they leave, you can guarantee that you'll never get them back. And it
Hmm.
happens quite often where people are dissatisfied with their, they think the grass is greener on the other side. They're
Hmm.
dissatisfied and they
Hmm.
want to come back to Streamline Verify. Or there's a new chief compliance officer that walked in that says, I'm familiar with the
Yes.
other product, the other vendor. Without thinking about the actual users, they make that switch.
Hmm.
So you never know when they're going to come back around, and you never know when the person will get a job somewhere else. So it's
Hmm.
extremely important to, you know, not to protect yourself on both ends. That's something that I
Hmm.
always, we're extremely careful to do.
I'm glad to hear it.
Yeah. So those are some great suggestions, things that I've come across myself. But of course, given that we're in the exclusion screening and sanction screening world, is there anything specific that you would advise folks to keep in mind when they're selecting a vendor in our space?
Yes, I think this is a little niche area to be conscious of. So anything that involves a service which requires sort of ongoing hits and things to pop up on an ongoing basis, it can be a little tricky to understand whether you've got a quality service or not for the simple reason that you don't know what you don't know, which is a little different, for example, to training. And maybe you get something and you think, wow, these graphics look like they're from the 1990s. This is not sort of sophisticated and shiny enough for me. It's very easy and quick to identify. So, when having your discussions with peers, try to look out specifically for those who have switched providers while working for the same company. The worst case scenario for them will be that when they switched providers, a hit came up with the newer vendor that the old one didn't catch. And so you'll know that the newer vendor is likely to be of a better quality. And so that is what I'd recommend. It's an extra step to take when looking at vendors in your space, Stephen.
Great. Thanks, Mary. We really appreciate that. Um, it's good that you have some actionable items to advise people in our space. We appreciate it. Is there anything else that you would like to get out about forging successful relationship with vendors?
Yeah, just one more thing. It would be that, this is a great opportunity for you, your vendor relationships at times. If there is a vendor that you are loving, such as Streamline Verify, get in touch with your representative at the company, make an offer to them to say, hey, I have really enjoyed our relationship. And I just wanted to let you know if you're ever putting in for a conference and you need an in house speaker to join you and we could do some thought leadership together, I would be up for that. And this is a really great way to send the elevator back down to your vendors because a lot of the time at conferences, the organizers are not always keen to have an entire panel of vendor speakers. And I anticipate that's because of concerns that it might get a little too salesy. So you're really helping a solution provider out if you put up your hand, and they may do webinars, podcasts, and other activities that you could partner on together.
That's great. That's really insightful and very smart. So we appreciate it, Mary. Thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure. Great to be here.